Nice to see everybody.
So good morning, everyone. It is Sunday, September 5th, and we are broadcasting from Houston, Texas. This is our Sunday morning, first Sunday of the month, Dharma teaching event, and we welcome all of you. It's wonderful to see you. So Ann and I always are discussing what to do, what to talk about, what to teach. And we thought that we would actually dedicate the next handful of our first Sundays to the teachings on the perfections, which will be also the topic of the first and third Tuesday Dharma explorations coming in the fall.
Next week.
First class is coming this Tuesday at 7 p.m. Central Time. The teachings on the perfections are teachings on 6 particular attitudes and virtues that are emphasized in the Mahayana tradition. And we won't be duplicating what our instructors will be teaching on first and third Tuesdays. We'll try to be talking about just useful, practical information that's related to the perfections. The 2 instructors coming in the fall are Nathaniel Rich and Renee Ford, and they're going to be basing their material on some traditional sources, as well as some sources that Nathaniel is working on, new translations for through the 84,000 project. So there's a lot of information coming out now in new translations, and we're very, very excited about all of that.
These are sutras that haven't been translated before. They're not just new translations. The sutras themselves have not been in English until now. And we're very, very excited to plumb those depths.
So in thinking about the first perfection, which is generosity, I thought I would tie together some things we taught this summer in the first and third Tuesdays, where the title of the first and third Tuesdays were connecting with oneself and connecting emotionally with oneself and others, and connecting some things we talked about there with some things we can think about generosity. And I'm thinking in particular about situations of conflict. And we talked some about that this summer. And I'm going to talk around a little bit. It's just some things I've been thinking about, and also some things, I work with couples a lot, and I see a lot about people in our culture through working with couples. So how does generosity relate to issues of conflict and working with couples and people in conflict? From my observation, many of us, without really thinking about it, live in when it comes to conflict, we seem to very, very rapidly move into what I would call a kind of universe of legal discourse. And legal profession is very, very important. I know I'm looking at least one lawyer in our audience who has helped us a lot due to her professional expertise. The legal discourse to a large extent, especially when it has to do with justice, has to do with acts committed, finding a perpetrator, and seeking justice. And that all may seem like it makes a lot of sense and it's relevant and it's useful. And of course, that is true in its place. But it turns out that that's not necessarily the only and or the most useful way of thinking about relationships, even when there are wrongs done and harm experienced. The legal metaphor is very, very much ensconced in a kind of language of individual responsibility, and especially, again, when there's an issue of justice, finding a guilty party and exacting a form of justice. When that occurs in a relationship, often what it looks like is one party seeks to blame the other party for a perceived wrong, and the exacting of justice can often be someone really screaming or yelling or being angry and literally wishing to punish their partner. Sometimes people do resort to violence, which of course is not acceptable. Within the frame of Buddhist teachings, Dharma, I think we can also understand conflict slightly differently. And I also bring some psychological understanding here. And it really, I will be bringing forth a model that to me is more concerned with relationship and connection and restoration of that connection. Just by way of interest, I've happened to read recently some material on a model. It's not very, very widely available in the United States, but I know there's a kind of pilot project in Brooklyn going on around what's called reparative justice. And instead of incarcerating, let's say, 17-year-olds for crimes that they did, and essentially, oops, I just lost us. And can you guys?
Can I help you? What should I do?
We still see and hear you.
Can you see us?
Can you
Yes.
get on the Dawn Mountain Sunday broadcast?
I don't
You
understand.
need to go to Google and
Think you can do
you
it
need to
better.
go to a
Here?
Safari and get on Dawn Mountain.
So I need to get out of all of this. But you can see us and hear us, Emily?
We see and hear you, and your Zoom account is still connected on that computer.
Okay. So maybe what's
Maybe
the fastest way back? Then we don't need to disconnect.
open the window.
Oh, great. Okay.
I got there.
Thank you.
I don't know how. So yes, reparative justice in Brooklyn, where instead of incarcerating or straight out incarcerating, just incarcerating and leaving individuals to be, quote, punished and actually become hardened and committed to a life of crime, they actually involve the victims and the perpetrators in conversations around what actually occurred, the impact of the crime, and ways of rendering amends. And the recidivism rate on that pilot project is much lower than the standard recidivism rate. So in terms of relational conflict, instead of finding somebody who is wrong and punishment, we're looking at something that more embodies the values of Dharma. And we're looking at, in particular, the issue of generosity. So generosity is the first perfection. And where does generosity fit into this whole Mahayana Buddhist enterprise? Well, it is a virtue unto itself, being generous, but also generosity is related to the larger enterprise of understanding the true nature of who we are as people. Now, it is a Buddhist observation that we get ourselves into trouble not only in this life, but in terms of future lives as well, because we hold tightly to a sense of self that is both permanent, autonomous, partless. It's not like we go around thinking, I am permanent, I am autonomous, I am partless. But if you really see what the basis of our reactivity is, there is a holding on to something that's kind of just solid and unchanging. And anything that occurs that is a change, certainly the large changes of death, but illness, we start seeing how vulnerable we are to pain and upset and suffering because we're holding on to a sense of ourselves as autonomous, independent, permanent. And a lot of reflection in Buddhist material then is on bringing to mind how impermanent we are, how dependent on causes and conditions we are, and an attitude of compassion in the face of the fact that we are impermanent, we are subject to causes and conditions. Generosity is one way of working with this tight holding to self. Often in Buddhist teachings, we'll talk about holding to I and holding to mine. And those two are related. Of course, when we have a big sense and a hardened sense of I, we also create a pretty hard sense of mine. Generosity is meant to soften that, to loosen up the sense of mind, to loosen up the sense of I. So how does that play out in relationship to conflict? Well, in many ways. So we have a conflict with someone. Anne comes late. It's conflict. Before therapy and before Buddhism, I might want to cuss her out. I might want to scream. I might want to stomp. Might want to take her moral inventory and identify her as inconsiderate, selfish. I mean, this is the way we punish in a kind of justice model our partners. We start taking their moral inventory. So the first place for some generosity is, in terms of what I taught this summer, is recognizing the difference between what we call secondary emotions and primary emotions. Secondary emotions are our reactions, our reactivities. I'm hurt because you've come late. I will fight, I will flee, or I will freeze. Sometimes we do some combination of the two. We might be screaming as we walk out of the house. We might just freeze up, shut down. These secondary emotions, these are reactions, fight, flee, or freeze. Typically, we understand that underneath those reactions are some sense of vulnerability. When you come late, if I can really calm down and get into myself and look at what is triggering my reactivity, I'm feeling unloved. I'm feeling unseen. I'm feeling unrespected. I'm feeling vulnerable. It's very, very painful. We typically don't let ourselves feel that pain. We get angry, we flee, or we freeze. All of these are kind of anesthetic to the pain that we actually feel when somebody disappoints us, somebody hurts us. Most of us have what we call defenses against feeling the pain involved in the activities that others do that feel painful to us. But if we allow ourselves and are generous to ourselves and to our partner in the sense of allowing ourselves to be in touch with our experience, there is a generosity involved in this, both to self and other, of allowing what is present to come to the fore. Annie, can you plug in this computer, please? No, it's a different plug.
Oh.
You have to find the plug. And
Okay.
plug it in.
Okay.
But in a way, even more interesting and important is when there has been this conflict and we've been able to do the work of recognizing that when you've come late, I feel unseen, I feel unloved, I feel disrespected. If we're actually trying to repair the relationship rather than punish, what do? Well, I, on the receiving end, by communicating how I am feeling, I'm trying to restore a connection. I'm invested in a connection with you. And this is a very generous and very compassionate maneuver. Trying to restore connection is very, very generous. And then there are two things that I think we don't maybe talk enough about when we're thinking, when we get lost in the whole legal justice discourse. And that is amends and forgiveness. So when you've come late and I feel hurt, you, as the person who have done something to stimulate something that creates pain in me, you have an opportunity for some kind of amends. And it's interesting when you think about amends, there are amends that you may feel comfortable offering. There are amends that I might feel I deserve. There might be amends in a legal system. If somehow something happened between us that was almost a legal event, there might be, quote, legal amends. But what's important, I think, between two people is what kind of amends can occur that work. Maybe you can't offer me the amends that I need, but you offer me the amends that you can offer. What I would suggest is that when there is some kind of conflict, can you at least begin to consider what are amends? I mean, I think the most effective functional amends are the amends that the injured party requests, but not every person can address or offer those kind of amends. You know, if I'm upset because you've come late, if you say, how can I make amends to you? I might say, please don't come late in the future. And if you say, I am committing to not coming late in the future, that might be, as far as I'm concerned, perfect amends. But I just encourage people to think about, you know, something's awry between me and another person. What amends might I offer? Maybe in the optimal relationship, we talk about amends, but sometimes I think we make one-sided amends because that's as good as we can do. But then there's also the kindness and the generosity of forgiveness. And again, forgiveness, it turns out, is a big topic. You start mucking around in Google searches on forgiveness, it's kind of a wormhole. You can just like, whoa, people really thought about forgiveness. And there's forgiveness that really is oriented at giving something to somebody who's injured us and really letting them know that there's some kind of repair at work, and that would be optimal. But again, sometimes that's not possible, or a person's not available, or you really don't even wish to engage with them more. But there may be a forgiveness that is a form of generosity towards ourselves that allows us to move forward with our lives because we're generous in recognizing that we're holding on to something that leaves us stuck and leaves us constricted and leaves us in pain. And maybe being able to even understand where somebody came from when they injured us. They were mindlessly absorbed in something when they hit me with their car. We all become mindless, and I can empathically appreciate that somebody was mindless. And at some deep level, I can forgive them. What an act of generosity. And this, I don't think either amends or forgiveness is easy. A lot of people, involved in spiritual work hear about things like amends, hear about things like forgiveness. If you read a lot of books on psychotherapy, there are people who will even talk about premature forgiveness. And that is somebody who doesn't actually process pain and doesn't have the emotions associated with being hurt or injured, and doesn't acknowledge that, and immediately wants to jump into, oh, I forgive you. Well, you do that long enough and you end up in some wonky places emotionally. You can have psychosomatic illnesses. You can be depressed. You can be anxious. Because when things hurt, it's important to be able to acknowledge those pains. Forgiveness and amends are a process. And I don't think in any case they're easy. But I think in terms of a teaching on generosity, when we start thinking about conflict and amends and forgiveness, it's really, really important to understand that these are processes that we can engage in that can be rich, may take days, weeks, months, or years, where we're not only reconsidering who the other is, and we're reconsidering who ourselves are, and we're also flexibilizing our sense of self in the process of understanding something like the vulnerability that we feel in a painful situation, and considering how to make amends to another. When engaging in a process of forgiveness, you'll see very, very much that your sense of self is very, very much engaged in all of this. And in each instance, whether we're looking at how we are subject to vulnerability, or how we can contemplate making amends, or how we can consider forgiveness for someone who has hurt us. In each instance, there's something going on in terms of the way that we hold to ourselves that is perforating and flexibilizing and tenderizing our sense of self. And instead of this hard, unchanging, brittle sense of self that we may hold on to, we realize that there's something alive, dynamic, vulnerable, open to change, open to a lot of nuance, as opposed to something hard and unchanging. So in terms of conflict, there is the legal discourse, and there is a discourse of connection. There is the insights we came to from the summer, that conflict can be a manifestation of secondary emotions, fight, flee, or freeze. That if we explore that, there's some sort of primary emotion of vulnerability, pain, feeling unloved or unseen. If we move out of a legal discourse to one of connection, we can bring in an attitude of generosity. And generosity towards ourselves includes recognizing the primary emotions under the secondary emotions. And then generosity can also occur between two people who have been in a conflict when they look at what has been the source of the conflict, the disconnection. What are those vulnerabilities that have been stirred, and the compassion and consideration for self and other in considering those vulnerabilities. And then also the generosity is associated with making amends when there has been a disconnection. And also the generosity that is involved in forgiveness, all of which conduce to a more dynamic, movement-oriented sense of personhood. So I will leave you with that for this moment. We will take a break. We'll have our meditation at 11 Central Time that Anne will lead. And at 12 noon, we will have a Dharma conversation period, and we'll talk about the whole issue of conflict, amends, and forgiveness, just in a very, very open way, and just reflect together about our own experience with conflict, amends, and forgiveness, and how these are processes. But we'll take about a minute break here, and then we'll move into the meditation. And then I'll be back at 12. Lovely to see everybody.